Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we're diving back into a really cool, but unfortunately not very long-lived series with Violent Messiahs #2. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in August of 2000, we see a really kind of jumbled and cryptic type of cover here. I'm not really a huge fan of it. I understand the idea that it's supposed to be mysterious. A lot of the story involved in this series has a mysterious feel to it, and that's the whole point. But I don't know, like, you look at this cover on the shelf and it's not really drawing you in from the standpoint that you really don't know anything about it, and it's not really doing a terrific job of, grabbing your attention and kind of conveying what you're in for with this series. I don't know. I just find it odd, but it's okay because there's a second cover that I like a lot more, and it looks like this. This cover is the one that I like far better, and in my opinion, it does a much better job of really grabbing your eye and drawing you in to be like, oh, hey, what's this book about? Obviously, Citizen Payne, who we see here on the front, is, a very important character in the series, but the story doesn't necessarily revolve directly around him. But then again, in 2000, seeing this image, I feel like it would have really, drawn you into picking up this book and at least thumbing through it and maybe asking, your local retailer if they had issue #1 on hand. It just, to me, really sells the book better than the other cover does. Creators: Joshua D.M. Dysart, William O'Neill. Writer: Joshua D.M. Dysart. Pencils: Tone Rodriguez. Colors: Travis Smith. Inks: Marlo Alquiza, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, Walden Wong, John Strangeland. Letters: Dreamer Designs, Robin Spahar, again, sorry if I'm saying that wrong, and Dennis Heisler. Covers: Travis Smith, Ed McGuinness. CEO, Editor-in-Chief, Jan Usteen O'Neill. Copy Editor, Peter Sanderson. Administrative Assistant, R.I. Gameo. That's a lot of people that it took to get this book onto the shelves. We see here that the book starts off in the Caracol low-income housing apartments that we saw in issue 1, as we see the police are swarming outside of the door, as Carrie was told by Citizen Payne at the end of issue #1 to go check out apartment number 14 in this building. So she says to come out with their hands up and gives them to the count of 3 to open the door. Upon 3, they kick the door down and are horrified at the scene they see inside the apartment. However, we don't see what happened in the apartment right away, as we are teleported to 15 minutes earlier back at the Port District, which is in a lot of disarray and ruin, as there were many explosions when the police tried to apprehend Citizen Payne with their sting operation. By the way, if you haven't watched my video on issue #1 of this book, I suggest you do, because it is a direct linear story, and if you don't watch issue #1, you're going to be really lost as to what a lot of the things that are being talked about in this issue are. We see Lieutenant Carey talking to the rest of her team, stating that she wants answers and she wants them to tell her that they apprehended Citizen Payne, or even that they managed to kill him. Unfortunately, he was able to get away in the chaos, and the helicopter that they have with them is of no use because of all the fires that are going on. It can't use its night vision or any of its infrared sensors, as they're just being completely overloaded. So Carrie decides to follow the lead that Citizen Payne talked to her about and go to the apartment building. So they all hop into some squad cars and start to race to another part of Rancor Island. Interestingly enough, I noticed while I was reading in this issue that most of the vehicles seem to be placed in an 80s aesthetic, and I'm not certain if this book is supposed to take place in the 80s or if it's supposed to be in the year 2000. They're not really too descriptive about the time period that this is all happening in, But like I said, the vehicles very much place this around like mid 80s. Uh, we see a long drawn out stretch of Rancor Island. It's not a nice place overwhelmingly. It feels a lot like rundown parts of Gotham City, as there seems to be a lot of anti-police sentiment. Many of the inhabitants are just kind of living their lives in, a very filthy type of metropolis. And we see that Carrie's thinking about the fact that, Citizen Payne isn't even regarded as, a vigilante who needs to be dealt with by the police, as pictures of his horrific crime scene victims, who, by the way, are all criminals themselves, are being sold at newsstands right next to nudie magazines. And this is all in full view of whatever children may be passing by the newsstand at any time. And she seems to just, be kind of conflicted about what her role is here and if she's managing to do any good, as she's really starting to beat herself up about the fact that Citizen Payne got away and that she and the rest of the officers spent all that time planning that sting operation, when in reality it was Citizen Payne who lulled them into his own sting, if you will. We then see the police cars pull up outside of the apartment building. Carrie gets out, looks around. She is noticing some dogs barking down the alleyway, and one of their fellow officers just says Lieutenant. She, however, seems completely to blank him out as she just starts barking orders that they need to get inside. We then see the scene that the book started with, however, from the inside of the apartment. As we get the 3 count, they kick open the door, and we see their faces as they look inside to notice that all of the adults inside of the apartment have been murdered, and in a really brutal fashion, I might add. However, the 2 children who were inside were spared and completely unharmed, as the older child just says mama, and the baby just screams. We also notice that there is some somewhat cryptic writing on the wall that is going to play a role later on. But I have to wonder, what was the point of starting this book with the door breaching scene that we see here from the other side to drop back 15 minutes in time and show how the police team got to there, only to then show the exact same scene again from a different angle? I understand that's something that's used in film quite a bit, but I don't know, in a 2D medium like a comic book, it doesn't seem to really hit the same way as it does in like a police drama where you're trying to create more of a suspense element. I don't know. Kudos for trying something different, but it just seems a little out of place in this setting. Carrie is obviously very disturbed by what she's looking at. However, she can't give into her emotions at this point because she has to worry about the safety of the children involved and also be careful as to whether or not the killer might still be on scene. So she yells at her fellow officers to get the kids out of the apartment and also call child services and EMS to make sure that they're checked out and that they're all right. They clear the rest of the apartment and find out there's no one else there, but they do find another body inside of one of the bedrooms. And then Carrie starts to fixate on the inscription that was left on one of the walls that says, "Dreams settle to become grass. Where once the world created me, I am now creating the world, and I have become so very, very aware." Seems like kind of the ramblings of a madman. She turns around and starts to exit the apartment, stating that she's going to go back down, and leaves the rest of the scene investigation to SWAT team and detectives. We also see here, as she's walking out of the apartment, a news bulletin comes up about what went down at the Port District with Citizen Payne. We see her then later on in front of the apartment, sitting on top of one of the squad cars, looking over at one of the children who seems to be in shock, which is understandable given that he just witnessed the brutal murder of his entire family. However, she is snapped out of it when she's approached by someone else. We now meet Detective Houston, who is now here because he's investigating these murders by the family man. She wonders if, there's any other reason for them to be talking, but he says he believes that the two of them need to start exchanging information about their two cases, as he's noticing some parallels between the two and wonders if they might be connected. She's very tired from the night and is not really in a mood to converse with him at the moment, but she decides that he might be onto something with his suggestion. Houston begins to tell her that he has things in his evidence locker that might be of use to her, and she starts to question him, asking, what it is he knows and what the inscription on the wall means. Houston tells her that the MO for the family man seems to be the same with every single one of his killings, this being the sixth one that he's committed so far, as he always goes in and kills the parents, but that the parents are always usually bad people. They're either abusing the kids or they're committing some other kind of crime like drug dealing or prostitution of some kind. But that every time that this happens, the children are completely left unscathed in terms of their physical well-being, that is. And he always leaves that same inscription on the wall. He tells her that the inscription, as far as he can tell, is a completely original writing, as he can't seem to find any reference to the words written in any other literature. She then starts to realize that it's getting really late and this seems like a longer conversation. So she tells the detective to meet her tomorrow, as she has a meeting with the commissioner back at the police station. He continues to start to talk, but she cuts him off and says, just be there tomorrow morning when we have the meeting. And he states that he's going to see her there. A few hours later, we are then teleported to Sherry's apartment outside of the building. However, we see the silhouette of what seems to be a man right outside the door. Sherry, inside of her apartment, has just gotten out of the shower, poured herself a glass of wine, and put on some jazz, as in her own thoughts, this is the only way to keep the dreams away. Apparently, she has trouble sleeping and possibly deals with reoccurring nightmares, as we once again see a silhouette of another character somewhere. She falls asleep finally on the bed with her pistol right next to her. As we see her lying in bed, we see the outline and figure of one Citizen Payne slowly come out of the darkness and appear in the doorway to her bedroom. She stirs, jumps up suddenly, and looks, but he's then not there. And then she lays down to go back to sleep again, however, this time clutching her service pistol. And we're left wondering whether or not Citizen Payne was ever there at all, or if this was just her mind playing tricks on her. We are then teleported to the North End mansion on Rancor Island, outside of the large wooden ornate doors that we saw depicted in issue number 1. We see Citizen Payne standing outside of said doors when a voice from the other side calls to him, "Good morning, Job. I hadn't realized you'd arrived." This is, of course, the point where we find out that Citizen Payne's real name is Job. As he enters the room, we see an elderly man sitting in a wheelchair. He is obviously in poor health and bad physical condition, even needing oxygen to continue to breathe correctly. He states that he's been watching the news all morning and is wondering how the police were ready for Job. Job states he doesn't know. As the man states, "Well, you seemed very prepared." Job states, "Well, I'm always prepared." Seems a little bit odd, this interaction, but it makes sense later on. This is the point where the old man states, though, that a police lieutenant showed up yesterday morning to question him about some leads that she had discovered at one of Job's other vigilante exploits, namely the scene we saw depicted in issue number 1, where he took out the 2 criminals in the apartment and had dogs sicked on him and ended up blowing up the entire apartment. Strangely enough, despite the fact that he talks about this moment where he and Sherry had this interaction where she goes to question him, and she even talks about it later on in this book, which we'll get to, this scene of the two of them having this interaction is never depicted in the first issue at all. Not visually anyway, which I thought was really weird, because as I was reading this, I was like, I don't recall that happening. So I went back and double checked, and sure enough, at no point are there any panels depicting this man and Sherry ever having any kind of conversation or her ever showing up at this mansion. Job seems to be a little bit surprised that she showed up, but the old man states that it's of no real consequence, as he tells Job that the information she had wasn't really of any consequence to them and doesn't really lead back to the mansion in any way. It was just, a loose end that she was trying to tie up, and that, he believes he's gotten her off the trail and just wants, Job to be a little more careful in the future and make sure that he stays focused on what their end game is. Job states that he will and that he always stays focused on that. The man then dismisses Job and tells him not to hang around outside the door, that this part of the mansion is, dank and moldy. To which Job replies, "Yes, Father," which is when we realize that this man is either Job's biological father or at the very least a man who raised him, and Job holds him in very high regards, as he seems to basically follow his every command without question. We then see this flashback memory of waves crashing on a beach and what appears to be a young boy walking up to the side of the water and standing on some rocks. As the wave crashes against the rocks, he holds out his arms. And we really don't know what any of this is about. However, it's assumed that this is going to play into the story later on. Meanwhile, back at Rancor Police Station in Commissioner Brimmer's office, we see that the commissioner is already engaged in a meeting with a man who is from the mayor's office, who is none too happy about what happened the night before and wants answers as to why there was so much, chaos and damage down at the Port District, and how this is going to affect the mayor in his re-election campaign. The commissioner just looks at him stone-faced, and the man even accuses him of being drunk. However, the commissioner is not really too happy about it at that point, and starts to, fight back a little and saying that, he's not in the mood to deal with this guy's BS this early in the morning. However, their conversation is interrupted when Sherry and Detective Houston show up. The commissioner tells them to both take a seat and get comfortable, as they're going to be here for a while to discuss what exactly happened. And then he wants them to give their reports. The commissioner states that they already have Sherry's written report, but he wants her candid opinion of exactly what happened last night to cause such chaos and so much damage, and, what exactly they plan on doing about it. Sherry begins to explain that Citizen Payne was doing a lot of his killings and engaging in a lot of his vigilante activity in a pattern around the port area for the last month. And she believed that they had discovered the pattern, but she now realizes that he was really just baiting her so that he could get a face-to-face meeting with her. However, the man from the mayor's office, whose name is Mr. Stein, is very unhappy about this explanation, as he states he's like, that meeting cost the city $28.3 million in just rebuilding costs, not even in lost income from the port being closed. And I do have a hard time believing that they would have come up with that figure in a few hours, as this is just the next morning after all of those events. Then the commissioner states that it also put 2 officers in the hospital, and they wonder why on earth it was that Citizen Payne didn't just pick up the phone. Houston then interjects and says that the costume indicates that he has a flair for the dramatic, and then apologizes for speaking out of turn. However, Stein then asks how he's involved. Houston explains that he believes that Citizen Payne and the family man are actually the same person, and that, there's too many similarities between the two of them to ignore. And then, also believes that they somehow think they're doing the right thing, as Citizen Payne always seems to go after criminals, and the family man always seems to, kill people who have done terrible things and are horrible parents, but that he always leaves their children unscathed. Stein interjects, however, saying that, those kids just witnessed their whole families get murdered in front of them, to which Houston replies that the man's logic is not sound, as he is in fact a, criminally insane killer who's on the loose, and that, he's not quite as with it as, perhaps Mr. Stein is, but then takes a jab at Mr. Stein saying, however, you do work for the mayor's office, so maybe I'm wrong. This, of course, infuriates Stein as he's, irritated by the fact that the officers are just showing blatant disrespect towards him. The commissioner, basically tries to get the whole meeting back on track and, basically yells at Houston and tells him to, keep his wits about him and stop being such an ass. Houston apologizes and also says that they found the body of a low-level street dealer who we saw in issue number 1. His name was Bargain, near the scene of the Caracol apartments. And when they went to his apartment, they found that the whole place was booby-trapped and rigged, and that apparently Bargain was a real conspiracy theorist and had all kinds of weird ramblings and writings in some sort of code that he had created himself, and had a lot of imagery of the North End mansion in his apartment. They, of course, though, believe that this isn't necessarily connected in any way, as they think that Bargain was just a bit loony. The man from the mayor's office, Stein, he then states that he's basically heard enough, and that, as much as he likes Brimmer, he's not sure that he's going to be able to keep the funding for Sherry's task force going if this continues, as they don't seem to have any results, and public support for said task force is basically non-existent. As he exits the room, he apologizes to the commissioner and states that he'll do his best, but he can't promise anything. As he shuts the door, the commissioner states to Sherry that, he wants this investigation to keep going, but she's got to come up with something, and that, he hopes that her days gets better in terms of what she's trying to find, and tells her to grab a bagel and a coffee and get back to work. We are then teleported to a random apartment somewhere else in the city, as inside of that apartment we see the family man who we met in issue number 1, sitting naked, meditating in front of some sort of incense and a candle, with the news on the television talking about the family man murders. He remains silent and then suddenly puts his fist into the ground and in one motion lifts his entire body vertically into the air. We can see that he is in exceptional physical condition and also seems to be involved in some pretty intense training, which would explain why he's so easily able to overpower his victims and not, really feel any sense of challenge per se, as we see there's not even a mark on his body, and he managed to kill 3 adults. You'd have thought that they would have presented some sort of, challenge or fight for him, but he was able to come out completely unscathed. Then later on in the day, presumably near evening, we are teleported to Guido's Pizza, where Detective Houston and Sherry have decided to meet to compare their evidence notes. The two of them start to realize the further they get into it that neither one of them really have anything of substance to go on. Although we do see, once again, a picture of the North End mansion, they kind of just realize that despite their notes being compared with one another, they're not any closer to getting any kind of lead or idea of what exactly is happening between the family man and Citizen Payne. Sherry believes that she's wasting time with this meeting now, as she starts to leave and states that Houston should call her if he finds out anything else. But as she's getting up, he tells her to wait. We then see Detective Houston state that his name is Ernest, which makes Sherry kind of giggle a little. I mean, it is kind of a goofy name. He then states that she's being immature, laughing at his name, and that he had no say in it, but then starts to kind of pour on the charm a little bit and state that this is the first time that he's seen her smile, and, that she has a very attractive smile that he finds very beautiful. And then starts to really go down a, I don't know, kind of dirtbag way of hitting on her, stating that, he'd like to spend some more time with her, but instead of asking her on a date, he says, why don't we just go back to your place with a bottle of wine and see what happens? Implying essentially that rather than, actually get to know her or go out with her or take her on a date, he just wants to go back to her place, get drunk, and pound her out. Of course, Sherry is really kind of irritated by this as she jumps up and asks him if this big swinging dick routine actually ever works for him. He, of course, says no. She then grabs her stuff and states that, I'll call you if there's any further developments in the case. He says okay, as he seems rather shocked, which I don't believe he should be, considering that he already knew that Sherry wasn't exactly the most personable person. And for him to just be like, hey, you want to go hook up later on? He should have known this would never go over well with her and that this would be her reaction. And honestly, this would be the reaction from a lot of people. I mean, they've only really known each other for less than 24 hours. I'm really shocked that this is the course of action he would have taken. We then see Sherry walking down the street of Rancor Island, heading home toward her apartment. Interestingly enough, I do find it odd that throughout this entire series, like I said, so far, all of the automobiles have been depicted as being from somewhere in the mid-1980s until right here, where we see what looks to be most likely a Studebaker from the mid-1950s. It seems odd, specifically that it's, a rendition of what I believe is a Studebaker being depicted here. Studebaker is a car company that had been out of business for decades by the time that this comic was published. And for one of their cars to be depicted in, a book that no other car from that era has been depicted in so far, it just seems really out of place. That's why it caught my eye. Maybe it means nothing, but I thought it was, an interesting little tidbit to see visually. Sherry opens the door to the front of her building, heads upstairs, and unlocks the door to her apartment, ready to go home for the evening, as she hates being in congested places with a lot of people and loves the fact that once she gets home and shuts the door, she's completely alone and is not bothered by anyone until she shuts the door and all of the lights go out and she hears a voice from across the room say, "Come." She immediately says, "Who's there?" and is very shocked and surprised to hear that anyone else is inside of her apartment. Then a light comes on and we see none other than Citizen Payne sitting in a chair waiting for her with his gun drawn on her. And then instead of just saying hello or any other kind of greeting, he responds to her with a very strange phrase saying, "Follow me, down priest and feast, and the song of the way of bones. Clear as day is the path." I have no idea what that means, but I thought it was a very interesting way to end this issue with such a cryptic message coming from such a important character to the story. It really just keeps the mystery going. We then get into the mail section, and holy crap, there's a lot of it, and way more of it than I think there should be, as most of it is just a lot of people kind of congratulating them on how good they thought the book was. And it's not just from like regular readers and buyers of the book. It's also from like personal friends of the guys who made this book, and just them being like, "Hey, congratulations on your new success," and all that kind of stuff, which is cool, I suppose. But like I said, there's a lot of letter section, as we're going to see in the next few pages. We here see the second and third full page of letters. Again, most of these are just praiseful. However, there was one letter that I thought brought up something interesting, as the reader said that, Citizen Payne's mask is very reminiscent of Spawn and Grendel. I agree that it's probably closer to Grendel than it is Spawn's. But, as the response goes, the idea of a black and white mask, with some stylized eyes is something that should be, locked into one or two characters, isn't necessarily the case. And, Grendel's mask, while similar, is different enough from what we see here with Citizen Payne that I think it's unfair to directly compare the two and state that that Citizen Payne's mask would be in any way like a copy of Grendel's. And, also the characters are so different from each other that, I don't really believe that there was any, malice involved in trying to copy someone else's work or anything like that. And I mean, Citizen Payne is not really similar to Spawn at all. I mean, there's no kind of like supernatural element or anything like that to his powers or anything like that. It's more of like a straight up vigilante crime drama, something more akin to The Punisher. So, visually, I understand, yes, you could draw a comparison between the two, but it's not a direct comparison, and the rest of the character is really dissimilar altogether. But wait, there's more. A fourth full page of letters. Holy crap, man. I can't believe the letter section of this book was so big. I mean, yes, it's a good way to pad out a few pages so that you don't have to pencil as much, I suppose. But man, like for all of these letters to be saying, relatively the same thing, I don't see that there was much reason to, include this many, especially when you could have put an advertisement or something in here and made yourself a little bit more money. Speaking of advertisements, we see here an advertisement for the Red Star. And the Red Star is definitely my great white whale, or one of my great white whales when it comes to collecting. I unfortunately do not have a single issue of the Red Star. I have collected issues in hardback, and I really love the story. And if I can find a full set of single issues of this book, I am absolutely going to buy it. I would love nothing more than to have the Red Star in single issue and be able to make videos on it. It is such a good series, and if you've never read it and you have the opportunity, I suggest you do. It's super cool. I really love how unique it is, and it's a fantastic read. The artwork is great. I can't say enough good things about it. If you get a chance to read it, do it. We then see an advertisement for Chassis Slicks One Shot. Chassis is probably the other most notable property that came from Hurricane Entertainment. It's a unique idea. I haven't actually read any issues of Chassis, but the premise of it is that it's somewhat of a futuristic world where there's like flying cars and robots and stuff, but the aesthetic is very 1930s-esque, very much the idea of like kind of Gilded Age and gangsters and, all that kind of stuff. And it's really cool. Like I dig the aesthetic, but it's just it's a mashup of like, high-tech future set in like a 1930s aesthetic. It's a neat idea. I don't know if the story itself is any good, as I've never read an issue, but if I ever came across any, I'd probably be willing to buy them just to check it out. We then see an advertisement for a contest to get published through Image. And I guess in 2000, Image was functioning slightly different. Nowadays, if you want to get published through Image Comics, at least the last time I looked at their website, all you have to do is essentially, come up with a unique idea, create, your comic book per se, do storyboards, give a presentation, all that kind of thing, send it to Image. And if they like what you're doing, you can get published through them. It's really not that difficult in terms of like the authorization process. You more or less just kind of have to have the whole thing mapped out, and it probably helps to have a few issues done already. They will talk to you about whether or not they think you'd be better off doing an ongoing series or perhaps a mini series. And, there's a whole process to it, but in general, it's not like, you can't get published through Image or Top Cow for that matter. Like it's more or less, you just have to go through the process of submitting your book to them, which is really cool. That's one of the reasons why Image now has such a wide variety of different types of stories and characters. And, it's not just the same old superhero thing. You get, titles that, are outside of the box, something like The Walking Dead, which has nothing to do with superheroes whatsoever. And it's just regular people trying to survive in a zombie apocalypse, that kind of thing. So, this is probably something that they would never do now, as it seems like this isn't quite the way they do business anymore there. And on the final page of the book and the reverse inside cover, we get two advertisements, one for Vagabond and one for Powers. I got to admit, I've never read either one of these series. Not that I haven't ever come across them or heard of them. I've just never, taken the time to really thumb through one and pick them up. If you have read either one of these, feel free to talk about it in the comments below. I'd like to know more about what these two stories are about, and if it's worth me picking up a few of these issues to kind of go down the road of seeing whether or not I want to make some videos about these different books. And that was Violent Messiahs #2. Overall, I think it was a really good book. It did a pretty good job of holding your interest the whole time and, giving you little tidbits of information without exposing too much as to give anything away. It's really kind of a fantastic example of how you draw or write, I should say, a mysterious comic book that, keeps the mystery going without being super confusing, but also being very entertaining. Outside of that whole little thing in the beginning where they did that 15-minute time jump, which I felt kind of didn't fit into a comic book medium. Other than that, I really have no complaints about this book. It's really just a fantastic story, and it's really interesting to read. But then again, those are just my opinions. Your opinions may vary, and you might think this was an awful story, but that's okay because we're all entitled to our own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.